everybody, welcome to another episode of Crush Live Poker. I am your host here, Bart Hanson, and today we are going to get into what is most likely going to amount into a multi-level or multi-episode um, show on the nature of value. Last week we actually did missed value at the smaller stakes. This particular week, we are going to review some 5-10 no limit and also a couple of hands from 5-5, talking about the nature of value. Still with the stress on missed value, but this is going to be a little bit different. I want to welcome everybody that maybe is just checking out the site for the first time. This is a training site that specializes in live no limit cash games. We do other games as well, but with specifically on live cash games, and we review live cash hands. This is coming from Stones Live, which is Stones Casino right around Sacramento. And like I said, we're going to play 5-10 and 5-5 or take a look at some hands from 5-10, 5-5. As always, you can email me at bart@crushlivepoker.com. That's bart@crushlivepoker.com. And of course, you can check out the forums that are over on the homepage. And if you're new to the site, you can click on the little chat icon that's directly below the player, and that will get you into a specific discussion about these hands. And you can look at the hand markers to take a look as well as a reference to specific hands. So 5-10, you can kind of see the stack sizes here. I'm not super familiar with these players, as this is kind of somewhat new source content for us. But this particular episode is certainly going to stress kind of missed value. The green chips are quarters, the reds are $5 chips, and the whites are hundreds. And of course, you can see the stack sizes here too. And in this particular hand, we're going to take a look at a seat 5 here. The Asian gentleman with the hat right across from the dealer. He's going to have ace-jack, and he's going to open it up here to 30. That's Danny. And we're going to see Dan call on the small blind with ace-9 of hearts, as we see Peter also call. And it's going to go about 4 ways, I believe, here to the flop. So, actually 3 ways to the flop. So you can see that Danny here has flopped, ace-jack, ace-7-4 here, rainbow. Peter gets out of the way. And Dan, who is in the small blind, is going to make a pretty quick call. So, talking about the nature of, the nature of value, you have to be a good hand reader to extract maximum value as well. So even before the turn comes out, if we take a look at the flop, a7-4, I open in Danny's spot, and, I get called from the small blind, and I bet and I get called. Because Dan is closing the action on the flop, he's not next to act. He can be a little bit wider. He could have a hand like a 7 sometimes and be peeling off. But most of the time on a board like this that contains basically an ace and 2 low cards, there's a fairly good chance he's going to have an ace or some sort of draw. Now, the draw that's the most obvious is 5-6 here, which is an open-ended straight draw. It's really the only open-ended straight draw that can come. And lo and behold, as you can see, the turn here is an 8, which is actually quite a big card for Dan because of the fact that he now has the nut flush draw. Now, this is very, very interesting, and the approach that, I take a lot to live poker, and what we kind of preach on Crush Live Poker, is kind of a fundamental approach to bet folding, meaning that you're betting and sometimes even raising for value. And a lot of the time, if your opponent comes back over the top, a medium strength hand that you're betting for value is usually no good. And that kind of cuts out all the pot control and all that other stuff, and it kind of really maximizes your value. Now, occasionally you get bluffed off of the best hand, but it's very, very occasionally. And this is a really, really interesting turn here because you're going to look at it from both perspectives. Now, if I'm Dan right here with the ace-9 of hearts and I check called this guy on the flop, he bet into two people. He might be bluffing. But let's say that I know this guy's game pretty well, and then it's usually an assumption that we can make that if we check this turn and Danny were to bet again, it means that Danny has an ace here, basically almost all the time. And that is quite common in terms of people's double barrel frequencies. They will have an ace here. They're not going to double barrel an 8 with like king queen. So because of that, and because Danny opened from, well, he opened from the hijack, but let's pretend he even opened a little bit earlier, from a little bit of a earlier position, because I guess they're playing a little bit short-handed here. We just make the assumption that ace-9 is actually not going to be the best hand when a guy bets twice here. So you look at this and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Well, can I semi-bluff my hand here? And the answer would be yes, in the form of the nut flush draw here, and it looks like we have 5-6. But in practice, and this is really the crux of live poker, people don't do that enough. If we're in Danny's spot, to worry about betting here and getting raised by ace-x of hearts that's turning their hand into a bluff, or say like 7x of hearts as a semi-bluff. Especially top pair, pretty much, you really, from what I've seen from live poker, is that, and I've been doing it for 10 years, playing and commentating, people don't turn top pair into a bluff all that much. So you can really safely, if you're Danny, bet this turn and fold to a raise because of the fact that Dan most likely will not check raise here as a semi-bluff if he has top pair. And that's what flows into that whole basic theory of betting until you're getting raised here. Now, ace-jack, obviously you could be value owning yourself, meaning that it's possible Dan might have a hand like ace-queen that he just flatted out of. I think a better example, or a more extreme example, would be to pretend that Danny has ace-king here, ace-king or ace-queen. But you'll actually see people check that back too, because they're scared of 5-6. And if the guy has 5-6, your hand can't improve. So it's not like there really is no need to pot control or to check back the turn if your opponent is never going to bluff you off the best hand. All you're doing is basically losing a street of value. Now, I don't mind the way that Dan plays this kind of somewhat standardly. He calls and then he checks the turn. And again, more often than not, a guy in Danny's spot will bet a big ace here on the turn, and more often than not, Danny will just call. He won't try to represent like he's got 5-6, which is why, or excuse me, Dan will just call, which is why Danny can basically not pot control. Now, Dan out of the small blind checks, and here we go. Danny checks behind, and it's just a street of lost value. Yes, Dan's got the nut flush draw, but even if he didn't have the nut flush draw, it's not like he would fold now. You'd be surprised how difficult a lot of live players have in folding top pair. So, live cash games are all about kind of extracting the maximum amount of value here. So it goes check, check. Now, the thing about this is that even though we spent a fair amount of time on that turn play, this is really why I picked this hand for max value. You see the case ace come out now. So in this particular situation, again, this is all leaning on my experience. If I'm Dan and I check call the flop and the guy check behind on the turn, and now an ace comes on the river, there's a very, very small chance that my opponent ever has a hand that beats me, even though we can see that Danny does. And that is because of the fact that most of the time, Danny is going to bet a big ace on the turn. And now when another ace comes on the river and he didn't bet the turn, you look at the combinations of hands, it's very, very unlikely that Danny ever has an ace here. Now, you could, I suppose, check to try to get a hand like pocket kings or pocket queens to value bet, to value own themselves. We talk about that, and value owning means that your opponent is betting a hand for value that he might otherwise fold if you came out and betted from early position. But that doesn't really happen in live poker either. So many times a guy will just check back kings, queens, jacks here. I want to make a bet here, and I would just make a small bet so that I can get called. So if I've got ace-9 and this turn gets checked through, I am pretty much never checking the river here. It doesn't make any sense to me, because if you say that Danny is almost always going to bet ace-king, ace-queen, yeah, he happens to have ace-jack, fine. Now, when Dan now checks to Danny, now remember, Danny played like a little bit of a pot control line on the turn. He didn't bet ace-jack, but now another ace has come. I mean, I would never not bet this. He checks it back, which is incredible. I mean, the times and this is a 5-10 game that you would see this hand go down in this manner where it would go check check on the turn and check check on the river. I don't know who's made a more egregious mistake here. Um, I think if you're Danny, when it gets checked to you on the turn and checked to you on the river, you basically have the best hand here close to 100% of the time. Close to 100% of the time. And not betting here for value is pretty egregious, especially when your opponent has a weaker ace. For Dan, from out of position on the river, he's got the best hand here, like 90% of the time. Not betting is fairly egregious, but it's not quite as bad as not betting if you're Danny. But you look at the turn play from Danny, which is kind of a pot control thing, and then on the river, the chances that you are going to get check raise bluffed on the river are so small, even at this level at 510, then betting is an absolute free roll. You have to make thin value bets. And the thing is that what if you were to bet if you were Danny here and then you somehow got check raised? What is your opponent ever check raising you with here that's a bluff, really? Unless he's turning an 8 into a bluff. And again, you just see players at live poker tend to call down much, much more than they turn hands into bluffs. So both players played this extremely cautiously, but the guy in position has to, I mean, he could have gotten, if I had played that hand in that matter, I probably would have bet 100 on the turn. The dude would have called. He wouldn't have raised. Like I said, I just don't think he's going to raise top pair with ace nine of hearts. He would have called. And then on the river, the pot's 400. I probably would have bet with ace jack 250 to 275. I'm assuming that Dan has probably a 3-betting frequency pre-flop with ace king. So the only hand that I'm really losing to on the river here is ace queen, because I think we would have heard from him with a full boat at some point. We beat ace 10, we beat ace 9, we beat ace 5. It's a must bet, and there's, again, some hand reading and missed value there at 510. All right, we're going to move on here to our next hand. And this is going to be interesting because 3 players are going to have pretty strong hands here. Now, you're going to see Kyle from seat number 2, who is a pretty good player from what I've seen at this level. And he's going to have queen jack of hearts. We're also going to see Anthony in the button with ace queen. And we are going to see another player with ace king. That's Peter out of seat 6. You can see the effective stack sizes. So Peter's going to make an open here to 40. Anthony here on the button is going to call. So this, the preflop raiser starts with 1400, makes it 40. Anthony's going to call. That's also going to bring in Kyle here. And this is sometimes a decent spot here to 3-bet squeeze. People know that I love queen jack suited for playability purposes. It really depends on how light Peter is opening. He seems like a little bit of an older guy, and sometimes you might get through him. As you can see, everybody hits a piece of this flop here. It's ace king. It ace jack for rainbow. And really, really strangely, again, I don't understand what kind of wacky pot control line here is going on in this game. Peter, the preflop raiser, checks. He checks the flop with ace king, and kind of more incredibly, Anthony checks. Now, not only am I not going to check ace king here if I'm Peter, I'm certainly not going to check ace queen if I'm Anthony, because I usually would assume that seat 6 is the preflop raiser, is going to bet ace king. He's going to bet ace jack. So we can bet kind of small, maybe half pot, something like that. I don't think Kyle's going to get too out of line with some sort of check raise. People don't usually make types of crazy bluffs on ace high boards. I mean, if Kyle were to check raise, he would be representing a pretty thin value range, and that's assuming that he would 3-bet with pocket jacks, pre-flop, pocket aces. Like, he might only be repping ace jack, pocket 4s, and some decent players understand what they're representing. I just don't expect him to make a move all that much, and I think he would have gotten a call from worse, some of the time too, in the forms of kings or something like that if you're Anthony. So, maybe if I had flat called with like ace deuce or ace three, if I'm Anthony on the button, I possibly check that back to get future value. But with a hand as strong as ace queen, um, I'm going to bet the flop, as am I going to bet the flop if I'm Peter. Now, the turn rolls off a queen, which is like a super duper action card here, right, on the turn. Anthony here makes aces and queens. Kyle makes queens and jacks. Peter picks up a gut shot straight draw, and there are backdoor spades. So the pot is $125 here. And Kyle is going to come out now and bet, which I think is totally fine. I think I absolutely would come out and bet now that I turn two pair. He bet 75. Peter calls. And it's like, if you're Kyle and when Peter calls, what kind of hands do you think he might have? He might have like a king queen, again, pocket kings, something like that. There's a possibility that he might have like ace 10 that he checked or some sort of ace that he checked. I wouldn't have thought his hand was as strong as ace king. But I don't really think he has two pair here, or he was still playing a set all that much. Now, for Anthony, it's really, really interesting, though, because when you're playing against a good player in Kyle, and I know that Kyle is a good player, I very, very likely may just call here with ace queen and not overplay my hand. I may raise because Peter's in there in the middle, because if I raise and Kyle comes back over the top, I think that Kyle, he's basically playing his hand the way that he has to, and ace queen's probably not going to be good, but you're almost never going to see a bet 3-bet here from out of position that is basically not the nuts. I don't think. If a weaker player comes out and bets out of the big blind, and I'm in Anthony's spot and I happen to check back ace queen, I'm going to certainly raise the turn. Certainly raise the turn when Peter just calls in between. And then we can get our turn value and then evaluate what comes on the river if it goes call, call. But this is occasionally like one of these spots where, you've got a good player leading out whose hand is entirely in the dark because it gets checked through on the flop. You've turned two pair, but you do lose to certain things like a set of fours or king 10. So the better the player, the more frequency I might just be flatting here as an over flat. And that's what Anthony does. I don't think it's a terrible play. But against typical competition, typical recreational competition, typical competition that I just, don't think is that good, with the preflop raiser calling in between there, I would probably bump it up to like 225. Something like that. And you're just never really going to get bet 3-bet. Except if somebody has king 10. They're not even going to bet 3-bet with pocket fours the way that the hand goes down all that much. Maybe if they're a little bit short, because you can have king 10. So we roll off here to the river, as Anthony did just overcall. And the river here is the jack of spades, which is quite interesting here because of the fact that backdoor spades have now come out. Now, if you look at this from Kyle's perspective, remember, it got checked around on the flop. He bet the turn and two people called. From Kyle's perspective, he doesn't know what anybody has. There is a fairly good chance. There's a chance. Maybe I guess I would say like maybe a substantial chance, maybe not a very high chance or a high frequency that someone has a flush, but it's probably in the middle here, given this action of bet, turn, call, call. Now the river rolls off the flush card. So the question here is that, if you're Kyle, you basically have the nuts. I really think so, in the form of, like, the only thing that you are ever scared of here or that you ever really lose to is pocket aces. I don't, for the reasons that we talked about on the turn, this is talking about hand reading and going back from street to street. I just don't see that that's really possible from Peter's perspective here. You would have to check aces and just call turn. So you have the nuts, in essence. I mean, you lose to pocket queens. Again, it's unlikely. There's only one combination of pocket queens because we have a queen in our hand. It's more likely that somebody backed into a flush here, or somebody has an ace, or somebody has a hand like king queen. And this kind of all goes back to the crux of your competition in live poker. I understand what Kyle was trying to do here because he's going to take a long time in check. He's obviously going to be going for a check raise for value here on the river against a flush. The problem here is that I just think that it's easier for us to see because we can see the cards. I don't know how often people are betting medium strength hands. I like to go for a plan of betting kind of smaller from up front with nuttish hands when people haven't really shown a lot of strength to get called because people just check back so often. Now, Anthony probably isn't going to check back a flush if he backed into like 7-8 of spades. But the problem is that, you know, if Anthony, say, were to bet if he did back into a flush and then you check raise, is he going to call? Now, there are certainly a lot of recreational players that are not capable of folding, so it is the way to get, a fair amount of value. But then there's a lot of recreational players or players that are playing just for fun that don't bet the river with hands that they should bet, specifically because they're incapable of folding to a raise. So the way that they patch that leak up is they check back really strong hands to not opening the betting up. So you play this game with yourself sometimes on the river from up front with kind of a nuttish type of hand where it's like, well, somebody should have a flush here. I'm going to check raise. And you can see that like both players check back substantially strong hands here. And I think at least one would probably have called the bet. It kind of sucks for Kyle, the fact that the jack was a spade and everyone's kind of scared. But I'm really, really surprised, at least if I'm in Anthony's spot, to check that back. Because, when you just call the turn here, you don't raise the turn, you just call the turn, and the river rolls off a jack, and now Kyle checks and Peter checks, you're almost always going to have the best hand here. I really feel that's true. Now, obviously, he didn't have the best hand, and I probably would have bet something like 150, 175. Kyle would have raised me, and it was an easy fold. But I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, the way that this hand went down in Anthony's spot, ace-queen's the best hand. And you cannot be scared of, monsters under the bed when it comes to value betting here on the river. Now, again, we can see the cards, don't want to be results-oriented, but I think that is certainly a bet here with ace-queen at the end. I think it's some lost value. He ends up looking good because he didn't have the best hand, but it's a little bit surprising to play that hand so passively. This was kind of missed value all around. I understand what Kyle was trying to do at the end. It didn't really work, but checking ace-king, checking ace-queen, pretty non-value oriented. All right, the next hand we're going to get into is going to involve Anthony once again over here in seat 9 and Zach in the big blind here over in seat 4. Now, I've played on Stones now twice, 1-5-5 and 1-5-10 game, and the rap about Stones was some people play kind of trappy, and there's a lot of like pot control going on, and I didn't really find that the 2 times I went up there. But this particular game was particularly, like I said, non-value oriented and like trippy, trappy, and just people just not putting money in, whether they're scared or just trying to play tricky, which is usually not going to be, and it's certainly not going to be the best approach to playing no limit cash games, especially at a lower level limit. And I think most people that are watching, especially new people, they might be, you guys probably are playing 2-5, maybe you're playing 1-2, 1-3. Don't be intimidated by the fact that this is a 5-10 game. These are the same mistakes that you'll see much more pronounced at the lower level, exactly the same concepts. So this is an interesting hand because it's a little bit similar to a hand that I played that I went over on the podcast from May 31st of this week when this video comes out, and I had ace-10 of diamonds. So if you're, like I said, if you're new to the site and you did a premium subscription, you can actually listen to the podcast from May 31st and take a look at the hand markers and the hand that I played, ace-10 of diamonds, where I called it quirk. Now here we have, I believe, a straddle here from a Zahn. So this particular hand was being played 5-10-20. And Anthony raised it up to 60, so 3x the straddle. Zach just flat called with jacks. So I mean that's, I think that I would be 3-betting with a fairly high frequency, but I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. I will sometimes flat with jacks here, but you're going to have to continue on if you face some overcards because your hand is, somewhat underrepresented for sure. Now here you can see that Anthony has flop top two pair. Um, so he's got king 10. He also has a backdoor diamond draw here. He had raised it up to 60. It's a pretty dry board. I'm probably going to bet like 85 here, something like that, on this flop, 75 to 85 into 135. He bet 95, okay. And Zach is going to call. I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that this has been played here so far. Now, the turn is the queen of diamonds. So this is why it reminded me of that hand from the podcast. So you can see here that Anthony now has picked up diamonds with king 10. Now, in the hand that I was talking about, the particular hand I was talking about, we'll see it, maybe I'll type it out here on the screen. I had ace 10, and then the board was ace 10 8 with two spades and one diamond. And then the turn was the king of diamonds. So I kind of had top and middle, which is what Anthony has here, with diamonds. But the thing with queen 10 8, or excuse me, ace 10 8, and then the turn becoming a king, I got two callers on the flop. And one of the most common draws on that particular board was actually a double gut shot in the form of queen jack on ace 10 8. So when that king came in, even though it gave me the nut flush draw, I didn't really want to get check raised off my hands. I was also in, there were two opponents in the hand too. But the flip side to that, though, is that the board is so draw heavy, you're going to get called by a much wider range because of all the straight draws and the flush draws. And I did end up betting, but it could have put me in a kind of a strange spot because of the stack sizes and getting check raised. This is a little bit different here for Anthony. I mean, he's heads up. He's got king 10. The only thing that queen really changes is if somehow Anthony had king queen, or he peeled on the flop with ace jack or jack 9. And I think it would be more like ace jack. So I am way, way more apt to bet here on the turn, as if I hadn't picked up diamonds too. I mean, like I said, with that ace 10 hand, I'm probably checking back ace 10 8 king with a higher frequency when I pick up nut diamonds than I am if I didn't have nut diamonds. If I didn't pick up nut diamonds, I would just bet the turn and then probably fold to a raise or evaluate. So if Anthony just had like king 10 of spades here, of course you just bet the turn. I think where it's concerning for some people is getting blown off your draw, quote unquote. But because that queen brings in just gut shots, I'm absolutely going to continue to bet here. Queen 10 comes in too on the turn, and you're just not going to get check raised here all that much. And if you do check raise, you can call and evaluate. I mean, you've got 13 outs basically against a straight. It goes check check, and that's in the form of 9 diamonds and then 4 full outs. So now the river comes a 9, and this is really the part. This is really why I picked this hand. I mean, besides the fact that I think that Anthony makes a mistake by checking back. Now this is kind of similar to the ace 9 hand at the lead of this particular video. Well, now Zach's got a straight. There's a one-liner out there, right, to a king. He's got 9 10. Jack, Queen, King. He also has 2 of the jacks in his hand, which means that it's more unlikely that Anthony ever has a jack. And Anthony checked back the turn. So I think you just have to bet here. Because again, it's been shown in my experience playing live and also doing thousands of hours of commentary and doing training videos that you can't expect somebody to bet 2 pair when you check to them on the river. So you're actually going to show way more of an expectation by just coming out and betting and getting called by 2 pair than checking and expecting somebody to make a thin value bet after they check back the turn. And usually you wouldn't think, the other thing about hand reading in this particular hand is you wouldn't think that it was really actually even possible that the guy would have 2 pair all that much because of the fact that he checked back the turn. Like I said, I'm assuming that Anthony checked back the turn here because he picked up diamonds, but if he didn't pick up diamonds, you would almost expect he would always bet the turn here with 2 pair. So when the 9 comes, unless the 9 somehow improves him to like king 9, but he opened from, let's say this is the hijack, but it's somewhat middle position in this particular hand. The 9 just doesn't like roll any 2 pairs. It doesn't really roll in, any types of 2 pair types of hands usually that he's going to open from that position. So it's all about like reading board texture and looking at the board and things like that. That's why this has to be a bet here from Zach, I think, with two jacks after it goes check check on turn. Now, now the funny thing is that Zach now checks, and again in this particular spot, now Zach would have gotten more money out of me because just like I kind of hammered Anthony a little bit in the previous hand when he didn't bet ace queen at the end. How is king 10 not the best hand here? Like, yeah, Zach played it tricky, and maybe Anthony does know Zach better than I do, but like, given this action, you bet flop, you get called, turns a queen, it goes check check, and now the guy checks the river, which almost always means he doesn't have a jack, even though we can see that he does, which is kind of weird. But let's just assume that he doesn't have a jack here. You basically have the only two pair that beat you is king queen. So you beat queen 10, you beat queen 9, you beat 10-9. You know what I mean? I think you have to bet the river here as played with king 10 when it gets checked to you. Now, if he had come out and bet the river, yeah, maybe you fold, and that's kind of the whole definition of a value online, where if Zach's playing against me specifically, and he knows that I bet thinly, checking pocket jacks could possibly be the best play because I might take a value online in Anthony's spot, meaning that if Zach came out and bet, I might actually fold a two-pair hand, but if he checks the river given this action, I'm certainly going to value bet it. So he actually makes more money by checking. But I'm not typical. That's not the typical play. You can see Anthony checks it back. You just have to bet your hand straight out. And the lower you go, the more straight up you have to play. Again, this is 5-10, but the lower stakes you go, the more you're going to have to bet your hand out from out of position when it's a near nut hand. We saw it with the queen jack. We see it here with the jacks. People they're not going to bet value. They're not betting thinly enough in position. They want to go to showdown. So you have to get the value yourself because it's been shown that they'll call your bet, but they'll check back some fairly strong hands. And that's exactly what happens here once again. King 10 checks back and Jacks wins. And I really do feel like Jacks could have gotten a call there, but he certainly didn't get a bet there out of King 10. But Anthony should have bet the turn. All right, we're going to move on here to our next hand, and this is going to be from a 5-5 game. So this is moving down to a 5-5 game, but they're playing it with a straddle in this particular hand, and they had been playing this night a lot with a straddle, so sometimes it's 5-5-10 with a little bit of shorter stacks. I was considering blurring out one of the hands because, I get a lot of positive feedback sometimes when I do that, but this hand was so unbelievable from both sides, talking about value, that I wanted to keep them open because, it could have been like blurring one and then blurring the other, but we're going to look at both perspectives like we did before in some of the other hands. Now here we've got a straddle from UTG in this guy John, and Sean, who doesn't really play, from what I've seen, like crazy loose, decides to make a crazy loose open here in this straddle pot from under the gun 1+1 with 5 deuce offsuit. And you can see that he only has about $415. So that is actually quite, it's actually accurate. Again, the red chips are 5s. The greens are 25s. We're going to see Richard make a pretty tight just call here. Or excuse me, Rick make a pretty tight just call here with Ace King. Again, playing at what is the equivalent of 5-5-10, only about 40 big blinds deep. It can be a little bit odd and tricky, 40 big blinds deep in a cash game, because a lot of times if you put that third bet in, a guy isn't going to really get it all in with you unless they have a pair or they have ace king themselves, unless they're crazy, and maybe they get it in with like an ace queen or something like that. That's why actually this is a good stack in a cash game to actually 3-bet bluff and then fold to a ship, because you put so much leverage on the other guy. They basically have to commit all their chips or fold. But ace king can be a little bit tricky at the stack depth, like right around 50 big blinds, because of the range that somebody gets in. Rick decides to call here, and that's not obviously the reason why I picked this handout, but we're going to talk about what to do here with these hands, with these stack sizes, and if we were deeper. So if I flat with ace king, I'm pretty happy with this board here. And I'm thinking about, all right, well, we only started with about 400 bucks. How am I going to get the most amount of money in here? Rick checks, and Sean's going to make a continuation bet, which I think is fine here. You're not really going to get called by worse, but it's certainly a bluff. Well, it's actually a form of a semi-bluff. He doesn't really have the best hand here now, but he actually could improve. And there's a fair chance he might get a lot of better hands to fold, like pocket sixes, pocket sevens, maybe even any hand that's not an ace. Now, with these stack sizes, I'm not exactly sure what Rick's image is. Like, if he's the tightest guy in the world where he breathes on a pot and people fold, then I could certainly see calling here because you don't want to see your opponent fold. But let's take this from a neutral perspective. Let's just say that your image is somewhat neutral or you're an unknown. I would click this right now. You're out of position, so, I mean, you could play a check call lead here on the turn so that it doesn't go check. Like if you call here, the pot will be 185 and the guy's got about 365 left, 2 pot size bets left. You don't want it to go check on the turn, but I think the trick here when playing against short stacks, just to raise it small. Make it like 110. And then that's going to guarantee you, like if you make it 110 here, the pot's going to be about 300. The guy's going to have about 300 left, and you can just follow that up with like quarter pot size almost to get all the money in with 1 pot size bet left or quarter to half or something like that. Just small bets with 2 streets left will get it done. So I probably would have just like min clicked this up, like I said, unless I had some sort of crazy, tight image. For some reason, if I'm the foreman, Rick just kind of nonchalantly calls. And again, we're going to look at this from both perspectives now. Pretty incredible turn here for Sean. And again, from a neutral perspective, let's say that Rick is an unknown. Let's shift our thoughts to what I would do in Sean's spot. You can see the flop doesn't really have any draws on it, like at all. I mean, yeah, there's like a straight draw, like 6-7 or 7-8, but you're not going to get that type of action anyways here on the turn. The guy might have a 9, but again, you're not really going to get a ton of action from that anyways. And because you have a 5, he doesn't really have a 5 here almost ever. So what's the next logical hand that he has when he flat calls your raise out of the small blind and check calls the flop? Duh, it's an ace. I wouldn't have thought that his hand was as good as ace-king, but it's pretty obvious that he's going to have an ace here. Like I said, we don't have to worry about any of the other hands. They're just going to fold out. We want to go max value against an ace, and that's really the key to figuring out and looking at your opponent's hand and then, understanding that no limit's about your opponent's range, not necessarily your own cards, besides the fact here that we just know we have the best hand. So now, if Rick checks to us and we're Sean and the pot's 185 and we've got 365 left, we've got about 2 pot size bets left. If we were to bet like 100 here and the guy called, the pot would now be 385 and we have about 265 left. So under a pot size bet, I would probably bet 120 here. Then the pot would be 420 and I'd have about 240 left and I can set up a shove. You might go a tad bit more, maybe 125. Something like that, and then you can set up a shove. That would be my entire plan here if I'm Sean. It's inexcusable to not get all the money in here versus an ace when you turn trip 5s in a straddle pot where you only started about 40 big blinds, 45 big blinds effective against the straddle. So it's all going to be about bet sizing. You've got to choose your sizing on the turn that will lead to a river all in. So Rick is going to check here out of the small blind. And Sean is going to make a very small bet, which I am not a fan of. I think he bets 40 or 50. He bets 50 again. And of course, the reason why I'm not a fan of that is because of the fact that he's not going to be able to get all the money in unless he makes a gross shove all in on the river, which he could do. But that's going to get a result less often of a call from a mediocre ace than it is if you were to just bet kind of normal on the turn to set it up with a shove. Now, from Rick's perspective here on the turn, if I were to just call, the problem now is that he bet 50 on the flop we just called. He bet 50 on the turn. Usually that size of a bet on the turn is kind of what I like to call like almost like a showdown bet, meaning that he's betting the same amount that he did the street before, and he's going to check back the river. So you can't let him, you can't just call. Now, obviously, we know that Rick doesn't have the best hand, but I'm trying to play it like we don't know Sean's hand. I'm trying to go into both perspectives. We got a pretty big mistake in sizing here by Sean by only betting 50 on turn, and a pretty big mistake in not check raising turn now if we're Rick, because if we call, if you don't bet the river, the guy's just going to check it back. Now, you could call and then bet the river, but you're not getting all the money. And like I said, I still like a click. Click it up to 110. If you make it 110 and the guy had like a weaker ace or something like that, you'd be looking at a pot of about 400 and he'd have about 250 left, just kind of like that sweet spot that we talked about from Sean's perspective of betting 110 in position. There's no way that I would just call if I had just called the flop. You know what I mean? And now the river comes a backdoor diamond, so if I did just check call if I was Rick, I'm definitely betting the river because I expected to get checked through so much. So it's a really, really strange way that Rick played this particular hand. Now, for Sean here, another thing that we actually didn't discuss that becomes somewhat relevant here on the turn is, and the fact that why I'm not a huge fan of that small bet size is that if a guy has a mediocre ace, on the turn, now that the board's paired, if a high card comes, his kicker's not going to play, meaning that he would be, if he thinks you have an ace, he would be calling for a chop, which makes it even less likely that he's going to call an all-in as a bet, because people don't like to call all-ins as, for chops. Now, I love this play if I think that if I'm Sean and like I had a hand like ace-10 here, and I think my opponent has a weak ace, I would love moving all in and try to get him off of a chop. But for pure value with 5 deuce, you don't want that to happen. You want to get called by an ace, which is why you need to bet bigger on the turn. The river rolls off here, backdoor diamonds. He hasn't really built the pot up here. I mean, you got to bet at least 150, but I would have been betting much, much larger. And like I said, if I'm Rick, I'm playing this hand entirely different too. Rick is going to check here. And I believe that Sean actually does make a substantial size bet. I think he bets about 150, so he makes up for a little bit of value. But I mean, if you put me in Sean's spot, I'm getting all of the money in. There's no way in the nowhere in the world am I ever leaving 165, behind here. And that's just, it just is what it is. Now, the crazy part of this hand is, this is why the blurring wouldn't have worked. I have no idea what Rick is thinking. But Rick is actually going to fold here. So it would have looked bizarre if I had blurred Rick's hand out and been like, I can't believe Sean left so much money on the table and then Rick folds ace-king. There's nothing I can really say about that. I don't understand how ace-king can be played that way. I don't know if they know each other really, really well. It's really, really strange. But I'm just saying from Sean's perspective, he's got to get more value in there from what would be probably 98% of the player pool calling down larger bets with an ace. And for Rick's perspective, from out of position, he's got to basically get more money in there from with what is a nut hand too in the form of ace king. So value lost by both players, and then Rick ends up folding ace king, which is quite bizarre. All right, so this is going to be the last hand of this particular episode. And this is played from a different 5-10 game at Stones. And this particular hand is going to be a straddled pot. So it's a straddled pot here by Azan here out of seat 1. And we're going to have Sean in seat 2 open this one up here for a raise. And we are not going to show his hand. So we're going to be doing some blurring here in this particular hand. If you're not accustomed to the blurring, we will do a reveal at the end. But we're going to play out of seat number 5 spot. And we are going to make the call of the $45 with Jack 9 suited. Jack 9 of hearts. The video will catch up here in a second. So raise here to 45 in a straddle pot. We make the call, and you can see we're playing on Aaron's hand over in seat 5 from the hijack. We call the 45, as does TD in seat 6. Again, we're playing out of Aaron's spot. And this is going to go multi-way here. So Sean opened for 45. He gets a call, a call. Looks like 3 or 4 calls, and then Azan is also going to call here because he wakes up with pocket threes in the big blind. So we're going to see this 4 or 5 ways here. It's actually 5 ways, so it's about a $230 pot. And here we go. Again, we're playing on an Aaron spot, and lo and behold, when we're Aaron, we flop the nuts. So the board is Queen 10-8 here with a couple of clubs. We have flopped the nuts with a backdoor heart draw, and it's going to get checked to us. Now, on this type of board with this type of texture, you talk about a wet board where any number of hands will call your bet, whether it is a queen, a pair and a straight draw, a club draw. And all those types of hands are quite common in single race pots, like a Jack 10, Queen X, Queen Jack, King Queen, whatever it is. Even like 10-9. It's a really, really, really good board to flop the nuts on because, if you flop pocket eights on an 8-deuce-deuce board as eights full and nobody else has a pair, you're not going to get a ton of action. Give me Jack 9 of hearts on this board against 5 other players. Yeah, I might get sucked out on sometimes, but this is going to be a situation where I'm going to be extracting the most amount of value, on this type of scenario. So if it got checked to me here, now remember Sean was the preflop raiser, he checked, but sometimes you'll see guys, play wet boards and multi-way pots a little bit slow, not like slow play, but kind of cautiously. Now, I would be betting here at least 150 with Jack 9 of hearts, I think, at a minimum, with this type of textured board. We'll see here what Aaron bet with the Stone Cold Nuts in a second. He bet 75, which is just way, way too small, I think. And it's not the idea that you're going to get sucked out on. It's just you're losing value from hands, I think, that would call larger bets. Because even at 5-10, people don't fold king queen here, ace queen. It just doesn't happen. So betting 75, I think, is way, way too small. One of the other concepts that we talk about that we don't really have to necessarily worry about in this case because we have the nuts is that betting a more standard size usually actually gives you more accurate information about your opponent's hand. And what I mean by that is that if you bet stupid small, unless your intention is to induce, you can sometimes get into some very, very sticky situations. Like, instead of us having Jack 9, let's say that we had 10-8 here. And instead of us betting 75 into 225, let's say we bet 40 or 30. And now, a couple people go by and then somebody raises us. And it's like, well, did they raise us because they have a hand or they're just basically picking on our small sizing? So when you have like intermediate types of hands, it can be very, very difficult to play. And not only are you losing value from getting, more money in there versus worse hands, but you're almost inviting somebody to take a pot shot at you. And inducing a bluff can certainly be a viable line in certain situations, but you can get yourself into very, very sticky spots when you use very small sizing. Now, 75 into 225 isn't crazy small, but it wouldn't surprise me, though, if someone might pounce on that, which, of course, with the nuts, obviously you don't mind. I'm just giving you an example of sometimes making kind of these smaller bets with non-nut hands, how it can get you into weird situations. So he bet 75, which I think, like I said, is like kind of lost value. Now, Sean calls. Now, this is where we get into kind of positional awareness. Sean was the preflop raiser under the gun, and we were to his left. So when we bet, everyone folded, and Sean called. Now, that means that Sean can be pretty wide here, meaning that, if we were to bet pot, let's say that, Sean was the preflop raiser, and we came out and bet huge, and he check called somehow, I think that we can basically dismiss like ace king there. You know what I mean? At that point, maybe he has a queen. Maybe he's got aces or kings that he's playing cautiously. But here, when we bet only 75 and everybody else folds and it comes back around to him, I think he can be rather wide here. He could have ace jack. He could have ace king. He still could be playing something safe, but he certainly can be pretty wide when there is nobody else there. To add to that first example, let's say that we came out and bet like 160, and then we got one guy that called, and then Sean overcalled. Well, then we know Sean has something. He's not just calling with ace king. But here, heads up, when everybody folds in between, I do think that he can be rather wide here. Moving on to the turn. The turn here is the queen of diamonds, which doesn't really change anything in terms of our hand if we're Aaron, because there's just no way, given this flop action, that Sean is ever going to have any type of full house here. Because when you think of it, Sean opened a 45. He got 4 callers. The board's super wet. He's never checking pocket queens, pocket tens, something like that. And if he is, he's very unlikely to just check call. So it's a bad card for us in terms of value, I think, if we're Aaron, just in the sense that, well, if he's got ace king or ace jack, he's probably going to fold now. He might now even get scared if he was playing like aces or kings defensively. If he's got a club draw, the board's now paired, yada, yada, yada. The only time that it's a good card for us is that if he was somehow checking a queen, like I said, playing that cautiously, king, queen, ace, queen, whatever he opens from under the gun. I'm obviously not going to check back if I'm Aaron here, but I would probably bet maybe 150, 175, something like that. And then if Sean calls, then we know he has a hand. He might very well have a queen, and we can take him to super value at the end. You know what I mean? We flop the nuts. Like I said, it's impossible for him to have a full house. We still don't know what he has. So Sean checks here once again, and like I said, I'm betting at least 175 here. Probably 175 to 200. Aaron bets 85 here. I mean, bet sizing is such an important thing for value in No Limit Hold'em. These are almost like bets like he's trying to get to showdown with these bets. Just 85. I mean, he's got the nuts here. What is he scared of? You've got to build the pot up here. And Sean calls again. And Sean can still be kind of wide here. I mean, I don't know if Sean's going to continue to call here with ace king, but I mean, he's getting like 4 to 1, something like that. You know, he could call with jacks, although we do block a jack, but you just got to put more money and you got to get more value. Now, crazy river comes off. Well, it's not really crazy, but crazy for what happened. The river now is a 9. So now there's a one-liner out there. And the only thing that changes in terms of straights is we lose to king jack. That's it. We now lose to king jack. I don't know if king jack is played in this manner. Again, we block one of the jacks. I guess it's possible, but we can't be scared of the nuts all the time. We had bet so small on the flop and so small on the turn. If Sean checks to us, obviously we're going to bet here again. How does Sean have a jack here? I mean, maybe he's got pocket jacks, but he's still going to just call. He might still even call with king jack. He might be scared of the full house. So not only, if we're Aaron, did we not bet enough on the flop, and we made a ridiculous bet on the turn, but he checks back the river. He checks back the river, which is just unbelievable to me. How do you check back the river here? I just don't get it. Like, what are you scared of? And, you wonder if he was just playing the whole thing sort of cautiously because of those small sizings. And we do a reveal here, and Sean had king queen. Now, I'm not saying that with that run out that Sean would have called 3 streets because of the run out, but he certainly would have called 1 and 2 streets. And if the river hadn't come a one-liner, he would have called 3 streets. He would have had trip queens. So, I mean, you're talking about going back and like having, again, like, we talked about from the hand before, I would probably, if I had played this, I'm just zooming back here, the pot was 205 or 230. I would have bet at least 150 on the flop, probably would have got a call from Sean. So then the pot would have been 530. The turn would have been a queen, which kind of would have sucked for us. Still would have bet like maybe 225. He would have called again. Now the pot would have been somewhere around 1,000 to the river. And I probably would have bet 300 or 400 at the end. So instead of winning 550, I would have won probably something like a pot of $1,700 or $1,800. So 3.5 to 4 times more with my larger sizing for value given on the board or the nature of that board. And like I said, we did a reveal. We didn't know that Sean had a queen going through the hand, but just the nature of and the texture of the board and what we have and what we think our opponent's range is when he check calls flop and check calls turn. With that, that's going to wrap it up for this video. And thank you guys for being subscribers. I want to welcome all you new guys that are checking out the site. And I will, again, if you are a Crush Live Poker subscriber, make sure you join Slack, download the app, and get on the WSOP channel to, kind of stick with the community here. When this comes out, it'll be right in the middle of Colossus, day 2. Looking forward to meeting a lot of you guys. So take it easy.